9 out of 10
Right.
colonists out of the 13 colonies,
Okay.
all of the colonists all together, 9 out of 10 of those colonies live in the rural areas.
Oh, so like on the farms?
Right,
Oh,
on the farms.
wow. I didn't
Yeah.
realize it was that
Yeah.
many. Wow.
So what we're talking about here to begin with is rural. And you know what rural means?
Isn't that like the countryside, like not the city, right?
Not
Okay,
the
okay. I
city.
remember
So
that,
this is
right?
home life in the rural areas, and 9 out of 10 colonists during that time lived on the farms.
Oh, wow.
And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing two
in this picture over here.
country-like scenes. You don't see any city buildings or
Right.
anything in there, right?
And the farming's going
Exactly.
on? Okay.
Now, farm families
Right.
only grew crops that they could eat. They're not going to sell them at a market.
And it's
They're-
not like they had like 7-Eleven or a supermarket that they could go to, right?
So they grew everything that they needed to survive, and they did it for their own family.
Okay.
Very rarely did they take things to market.
Was it
Okay?
just food that they made for themselves, or did they make like everything, like clothing and all that?
Yeah,
It's
they made
everything,
they
right?
made
Wow.
everything. So if they wanted clothing or wool, they would have sheep or whatever on their farm, their family farm.
Wow.
Yeah. hmm
It's definitely different than what we're
Right.
used to, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Chores. Well, you can tell in both of these that that's exactly what these people are doing. This guy up here, he's what would you call that? What do you call
Just
that?
kind of like plowing the
Plowing
fields,
the
yeah,
fields,
like in,
yeah,
right,
exactly.
right.
So that's probably his main job. I would say that he's probably the head of the family,
Yeah.
or an older boy in the family.
And in
because
this
that's
picture-
pretty hard work.
Down here, she'd probably one of her chores would be
Tending to the fire, cooking, making sure that when the chores were done on the outside, that she had things for them to eat. And you can see here in the other this other guy, he's
Right.
bringing the supplies to her, and
oh, like pails
that
of
might have
water
been
and stuff like that.
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah. Mhm.
cool.
They had very simple homes, as you can see here. The one on the bottom here is a probably a grass sort
Right.
of house made out of grass.
Some basic
and
lumber
some
there.
basic lumber. And then you have up here, and the other one is a little bit more sophisticated. It looks like
Right.
one might be, the barn itself might be, have a thatch roof is what we call that, or a grass
Right.
roof, and the other one is more structured with more wood, and you actually see the fireplace. You don't see a fireplace
Right.
in this other
So
one.
definitely not like an
Right.
apartment building or anything
Exactly.
like that.
So very,
just the house.
very simple homes. Matter of
Cool.
fact, Greg, you're not in one of these homes. It's one room for the entire family. So you're going to eat, cook, sleep, everything in one single room.
So everybody's
so if you
together.
can imagine, exactly.
So not very much privacy.
Exactly. So I'm
Okay.
going to try and draw something here.
Okay.
And I'm not very good at this, but here is the floor plan.
Okay.
So you might have the fireplace over here,
Right.
and you might have a bed here and a bed here, and actually there wouldn't be a toilet, Greg.
Oh, you would have to go
Nope,
outside.
you have to go outside.
That doesn't sound like very much
exactly.
fun in the winter
so,
if it's
so
cold
the
out.
whole family, if there's 5 people in your family, you're living in this one room right here. One
Probably
room.
gonna get in lots of fights.
Yes,
that
probably.
goes.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, but very simple life, but hard work, because you're
Okay.
going to do a lot with the chores. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So the next thing that we can talk about here is life in the urban areas.
It's like cities, right?
Right. So urban. Let me see if I can do this. We're talking about the word urban, which means
It's kind of like the opposite of rural, right?
right.
And
It
like the
means
city.
yeah, it's the city. So you can see in these pictures, especially the one in the upper right-hand corner there, that that's city life. Now that doesn't look like the city of Denver.
Right. Right.
Okay, but in colonial times, that was very much a city, and it was a very busy, bustling place to be. In contrast to the rural setting, where you didn't have neighbors right next
Yeah,
door.
not as much
It was
going
few
on.
and far between that people lived. Okay.
And so this 1 in 20 is
one-
that's
1 in 20 colonists lived in the city.
Oh, so not very many at all.
Not very
it was
many at
definitely
all.
the minority. Got it.
So there were more colonists living in the countryside or in those rural areas than in the urban areas.
Okay.
The heart of the city was the waterfront.
Okay.
Now, waterfront is, if you can imagine, the coastline.
Right.
And anything that is, if this is the coastline,
Right.
and this is the ocean,
Okay.
the cities were developed on, let me see, this side.
Oh, I see.
Okay, so
So
why
very
do
close.
you think that would be though? I know you can probably remember
It's
that.
probably, I would imagine, it has to do with just having drinking water, maybe using it for energy, things like that. Does that sound
Well,
right?
if you think about it, the ships
Oh,
from,
and
the
they get
ships
supplies,
from
right?
England, yeah, they're gonna come up.
It's like the
and-
closest way. That way they don't have to
Exactly.
hike in
Exactly,
super far.
exactly.
Ah,
So it's like one-stop shopping.
cool. Okay.
Features of the city. We have anywhere from marketplaces, and we're not talking a mall.
Right.
Okay, marketplaces. If you think about what you might know today, is if you go to the flea market, how it's an open air market where you just walk up and
Right.
you see, you don't even open a door, right?
It's all just out
It's
there.
all out there, and those were the kind of markets that they sold their goods in through the
Okay.
market. But some of these in this upper right hand picture here,
Right.
these might be actual shops or that you could go into. Let's
Okay.
just say that you needed a clock.
Right.
You would go into a shop for a clock, and you would tell the
Ah.
clockmaker, make me a clock.
Got it. And I
Okay.
noticed like the big difference in the cities, though. Those houses or buildings are right next to each
Yeah,
other.
they're very close together.
Okay.
So not only were they very close together, but the whole place, the whole city was noisy and smelly.
Ah,
Now,
okay.
why do you think that would be?
Well, the first thing I'm noticing is the horse walking along
Yeah,
there, and
yeah.
when I see horses, a lot of times they do some poo poo.
Yeah, and they and they
And I
smell.
can't imagine. And who's going
They
to clean
smell.
that up? I would
And-
imagine they probably didn't clean that up very
Exactly,
well.
and then you have the little boy there. Now, little boys do what?
All kinds of smelly things.
Yes, they do all kinds of smelly things. So if in those homes they needed to throw out their trash, well,
Right.
where did it go?
Oh,
Because
yeah,
they don't have
right
any,
out on the streets, right? It's
exactly.
not
They
like
would
they
go
took it
onto the
away.
street, or they would bury it, or whatever. So in these homes, there were no running water.
Yikes.
So you would have to bring in your water. So if there's no running water, you don't have a flushing toilet.
Wow.
So most times, and this was even in the rural area, they would
Right.
have little buckets that you would go to the bathroom in,
Ah,
and then
that
where are you going to
sounds
put that?
smelly.
Yeah. So if you've ever been, up camping and you are in an outhouse and what that smell is like,
Right.
we're talking along those lines, and
Okay.
and it was very smelly.
Yeah,
Okay?
not good.
Noisy because a lot of people were in one place.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense.
Go ahead then. Homes were very close
yeah, we
together,
saw
and
that
you can
earlier,
see
right?
that very, very close together.
Heating and lighting.
Yeah,
So
heating and lighting. So, in colonial times, the only way they got heat, a heat source, was through the fire.
okay.
So you see in the middle picture that the fireplace not only was a source of light, but it was a source of heat
Right.
for your entire home. Okay, so lighting on the outside, inside, or actually in the city, you would see lanterns that had candles on the inside.
I always picture the light post right outside.
Uh-huh.
We're just so used to electricity, but
Yeah,
like having a
exactly.
actual
So
flame in
someone
there.
had a job to
candle.
go around and light the candles.
Wow.
It was kind of cool.
Cool.
So the other way that you had light, again, was with some sort of flame, and they would have candles inside their homes, and when they needed to move around,
Just like a nighttime, right? To be
yeah,
able to read or
exactly. It would
see
be like
something.
walking around with a flashlight in
Uh-huh.
our time.
And then
you
if
want to
you-
look at it that way.
Trip and fall over, and there's some hay or something, or
Yeah,
it could lead
well,
to the.
yeah, it could lead to the fire danger.
Right.
Fire everywhere, and mostly everything was built of wood. So if, like you
Not a good
know,
mix, right?
it's like putting a match in some dry logs or something,
It's
it's
gonna
going to
catch on
start
fire,
on fire.
right.
So and a lot of cities actually were completely demolished because
Some
somebody would
random
drive the
guy
car-
made a mistake and
Exactly.
burns the whole
and,
city
and
down.
we didn't
Wow.
have a fire
I
department.
wouldn't want to be that guy.
There was no fire department. That they would try to put the fire out as much as they could with the people living in the city, but they would have to have a water source, and then they would have to try and put the fire out using
So
buckets.
sometimes a whole city
So
would
sometimes
burn
the whole
down.
city
Wow.
would burn down. So
Cities are definitely different, huh?
Cities are different, but still kind of a hard life.
Okay.
Okay, so now we can move on to what society was like.
Okay.
Now, can you tell me what you think you remember about what a society is? This word right here.
Isn't society is where you have a lot of people kind of living together in a common area? Does that sound
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly,
okay.
and it's their way of life, kind of. I know that sounds like culture, but in a society there are certain rules and regulations.
What
So,
you can and can't do.
Can and
Okay.
cannot do, exactly. So we're going to talk about the rights of the colonists.
Okay.
Now, these colonists came from England,
Right.
like you've learned already. Okay, they came from England, so they considered themselves English citizens.
Okay.
So they had a king,
Okay.
and they had to follow the rules of England.
And it remind me, like when it's a king in a monarchy,
Hmm.
the king's got all the power, right? So they wouldn't necessarily have a whole lot of.
Right. I think at this time probably at one time it was an absolute monarchy,
Right.
but then the time of the colonists coming over, I think it was a constitutional monarchy.
Okay, so and that's the whole, like, going back to like the Magna Carta
Exactly.
was earlier, where the king started losing some of his power, and then the
Exactly.
citizens started getting more and more of their power.
Right, and so the if you click it one more time, all of these, the Magna Carta, the Parliament, and the English Bill of Rights. The Magna Carta is kind of like our Constitution.
Okay.
It sets up the form of government.
Okay.
Okay, in the Magna Carta, it calls for a Parliament, which is kind of like our Congress.
All right. So they
we
start
have-
to get some
we have
representation.
two houses of our in our Congress, and there's two parts to Parliament, and the English Bill of Rights. So what these three,
So the Magna Carta,
all
the
of
Parliament,
these
and the Bill of
equal
Rights.
citizens having a voice in their government.
Okay.
And that's very important to understand, that in early colonial times they had the idea,
Uh-huh.
because of where they came from, that they had a say-so in how their government was
Oh,
ran.
okay.
So their voices were heard. And so you see in the picture here, men voicing their opinions in government,
Right.
in some
okay.
sort of parliament. So that's very important to understand.
All right. That makes a lot of sense. Oh, crime and punishment.
Oh,
Oh, this is interesting.
This ought to be really fun. Okay.
So I know we have major crimes and lesser crimes.
Okay, each of the colonies basically had their own set of laws.
Okay.
But the master law, just like it is in our country, each
Right.
state has their own laws, but there's the federal law or the Constitution.
Okay, right.
So in England, you followed one set of laws.
Okay.
But when it came to the colonies, each of the colonies had their own government.
So it might be different going from like the
Their
southern
own
colony
set
up
of
to
laws.
the New England
Exactly.
colonies. That makes sense.
Exactly. But,
So what's happening to this guy?
well, that's the next thing.
Okay.
This guy here was probably
That would be more like
he
a lesser crime?
Was
or?
a lesser crime.
Okay.
So what would you think might be a lesser crime?
Um,
Something that obviously he's not.
Maybe he stole like an apple from a store.
He
or
could
like
have
something
stole.
Like that.
Let's see. He might have. You know what forgery is?
Isn't that where you try and say like something's yours and it's not, or?
Or you signed your name
Oh,
to something
right.
that really wasn't yours, or
Okay.
something like that.
So some smaller thing
right.
that he did.
Theft. Theft was probably really big. But
And
if
if
you
so,
were
like
caught,
if you got caught, you're thrown in that thing.
yeah, that thing is called stocks. The
stocks,
stocks. Yeah,
yes.
exactly. So they did. They put your head in there, and you had to stay there, standing up like that
For a while, right?
Depending on what your crime
Oh,
was.
the longer, or like maybe the
So,
more severe the
yeah,
crime,
exactly.
the longer.
So the longer. So what was really weird about this is that you were displayed. It was
In
kind
front
of
of everybody, so yeah.
you were humiliated. So this little boy there is just watching.
I
but
noticed he's
got
coming up with something in his
yeah,
hand,
what do
right?
you think? What do you think that might
With
be?
the red and the green, it's got to be like a tomato or something, right?
Yeah, and so when
Is he gonna
so when
throw
the
it
law,
in the guy's face?
yeah, he could throw it in his face and further embarrass him. Now, if you think about it, if you're in there for days, where are you gonna go, potty?
Oh,
You don't.
I'm stuck.
So I tell you what, isn't it really embarrassing when you pee your pants?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm telling again.
Okay, but I'm noticing down here in the left-hand corner that that's a
Wow.
noose, right? And
Yeah, so we're
isn't
talking
that for the old like death by hanging? Where
death by
yeah.
hanging, yes, because major crimes. We're going to talk about major crimes.
Okay.
Now the major crimes are, what do you think a major crime might be?
Like killing somebody.
Murder.
Murder, yeah.
Murder. Let's see, what else could there be? Oh, the big one back then, go against your country. What's that
Oh,
called?
treason.
Treason, exactly.
Right.
Treason. You go against your country, that's the worst offense that could possibly be, and it would mean death.
Okay, all right.
Okay. Now,
Crazy stuff.
I have Puritans up here, okay? And the
And
reason...
I think I remember, weren't the Puritans out of all the different groups the kind of the most strict
Exactly.
and real kind
Most
of...
strict.
Our next slide, it looks like we're moving into, I would guess, what looks like slaves. I know that like, from what I remember in the earlier levels,
Right.
that like the whole triangular trade, slave trade, and that definitely was a part of the colonies as well.
So slavery existed throughout the 13 colonies, but it was most prevalent, or it happened the most
Right.
in the southern colonies because of the large plantations.
And that's where a lot of the slaves were
They
kind of
needed,
forced to work.
forced to work because they needed someone to produce all of the cotton on the plantations, or in the South where the tobacco plantations were, they needed somebody to do that work. So they imported the slaves,
Okay.
human beings from Africa, as part of the triangular trade.
So life was hard as is if you weren't a slave, and this is just like a whole new level of just like
Exactly.
really horrible.
So do you remember anything about the Middle Passage?
Remind me, wasn't it
Well, you notice that in this first picture here,
right?
that these slaves are on a ship. And do they look like they want to be there?
Definitely not.
No, so they're kidnapped, basically, from Africa, forced to go on these ships. And you'll see
right.
the one young man going into the ship. Well, in the ship, they actually had layer after layer, or floor after floor
yes.
in the ship, and they would either, most times they were laid, the human would lay down
Right.
on these planks.
And there wasn't a
so
lot
they
of room
could
to
get,
move around.
No,
and you
so
were
they could
cramped,
get
it was hot.
as many slaves, or as many of these people on this ship as possible, because that, for economic reasons, the more you brought to
Right.
the colonies, the more
Like
money
more
you were going to
profitable,
make.
the more
For
money.
economic reasons,
Wow.
yes. So it was a miserable trip across
Okay.
the ocean, and many Africans died along the way.
And I remember hearing, I forget where, that the majority of slaves that were brought over worked on these farms, and there was a smaller chunk that worked maybe in the north or
Right.
in other or northern
Right.
colonies.
But
right?
yeah, like I said, throughout the whole colonies there was slavery, but you're going to find more slaves in the southern region than
Okay.
you are in the northern region.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And so they worked, like I said, a lot of jobs, but primarily on plantations.
Okay, it looks like this next slide coming up is class differences,
Class differences.
wealth and success. I see this pyramid coming up.
Right, so that's a social structure.
Okay.
I'm sure you've seen that before.
And I always just think of like today, like we have classes like Bill Gates is in a really high class
So,
compared to other people in our
So
society.
Bill Gates would be at the very
At the
top
very
of your
top,
structure.
right?
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was
okay.
and then maybe
okay.
like I remember all growing up like my family didn't have very much money coming over, so we wouldn't be in the class that
No.
Bill Gates was in. We probably would have been this lower
in the
one.
lower
right.
in the lower part.
But
yeah,
now that
exactly.
we're teachers, we're probably kind of somewhere.
In the middle, maybe.
the
but
middle-ish,
some
yeah.
days it feels like
Some
down
days
here.
it's
But okay. Yeah.
Okay, but back then in
Yeah.
colonial times, it was the same thing, right? They had
Right.
a few different
So
classes.
we had upper class and planter class, and actually these two. Let me see if I can get this to work again.
The planter class and the upper class.
Both of these are upper class, but most times, like in our society, we have an upper class.
Okay.
But in the South, they weren't necessarily called the upper class, they were called the planter class. And that's where this upper part of colonial society, was the upper
Okay.
class or the planter
And the
class.
planter class was like the plantation type owners, isn't that where it comes from? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And in a few minutes here, I'm going to show you what they would look like
Oh,
if you
okay.
saw them out on the street.
Cool. Okay.
So the other is the middle class, and obviously that is right here. So you can tell that it's probably the majority of society.
Okay.
And I'll show you in a few minutes and talk to you about the middle class.
Okay. And then next up, it looks like the lower class is another chunk.
Yeah, that would be right here.
Okay.
Okay, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes.
Okay, and then
And
last
then
but
you
not
had
least.
indentured servants and slaves right here. In a few minutes, we'll talk about indentured servants.
Okay. All right. So
Okay.
here we go. So this is what you were talking about. Here
Exactly.
we go.
So we have in this first box the upper class, and you
Okay.
can see rather fancy home.
Yeah, and I notice the way they're dressing. is very
Exactly.
fancy.
So
Okay.
you can see the wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, you can see the wealth in the way that they carry themselves. You've got the woman with the fan.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
Even though it's
part
older,
of the upper
I can
class
still
or
tell that
planter
they
class.
look like they have a lot of money.
And
Right.
I would say that in a city, the upper class would live in a two-story structure.
Oh.
Okay, and in the planter class in the South, because it's more of a rural area, you would still have what I would call a humongous house.
Okay.
Okay,
A big
and you can
mansion,
see that
kinda.
that's very large.
And then over here with the middle class, looks like we've got two pictures for that.
Yeah, we have two pictures for that, and the first one, those are artisans because they're making something for society.
Okay.
Okay, and somebody's going to buy their product, and you can
Okay.
tell that they're dressed differently than the upper class.
And they kind of look like they're maybe like businessmen that are
Exactly.
making their own
Mhm. I
stuff.
mean, they're
and
not
they don't
wearing
necessarily-
shirt and ties like we know
Right.
business people today, but they look very much like workers as opposed to the upper class that they don't really look like they're working.
Right. And they don't, in the middle class, they might not even have to work for somebody. They might be their own bosses. Or
They might
can
be their
have
own boss,
shops.
exactly. And then in the second picture for the middle class, farmers were part of the middle class.
Okay.
And a lot of the reason for that is they produce something for society.
Okay.
Okay, so both of those artisans and farmers were considered a higher class
Okay.
than lower class or indentured servants and slaves because they were productive to society.
Got it. And so this lower class, would this be more like people that are working for other people or don't maybe even...
Exactly, or they're dependent on others for their survival.
Okay.
Okay, and then we have indentured servant, which is, and it's kind of complicated, but indentured servants, if you were in England,
Uh-huh.
let's just say you were, Greg, and you really wanted to come
Right.
to the colonies,
Right.
but you couldn't afford to go,
Right.
okay, you would find somebody in the colonists that wanted you to come there. And
Okay.
they would pay for your passage
In exchange,
for
me having to like work
work
for
for
them.
them. So you're going to pay off your passage by working for them.
Got it.
Now you're
Which
going to
is
sign a
different
contract.
from
That's
a
not a
slave.
slave because you're volunteering to be a servant.
Okay.
Because you really want to go.
And
to
it's
the
going to
new
end.
world.
Like
It
once
will
I
end.
do my
you're
time,
gonna sign
I'm
a
done.
contract.
Okay.
Actually, you're going to sign a contract for a certain
Maybe
period
like
of
2
time.
years,
Exactly.
and then I'm free.
Yeah,
Good to
and
go.
they'll take
Okay.
care of you.
Okay.
You know, they're not going to pay you in any kind of cash.
Right.
You're just going to work off that amount of money.
Okay.
Now, slaves, obviously, we've talked about that
Right.
already.
Didn't have choice. You
they didn't
had
have
to.
any choice
Forced.
at all. You were
Okay.
forced to work, and you had no control over your life. Now, if you were an indentured servant, you could get out of that situation.
Right.
The harder you worked, and
Right.
then you would be free to do
Once
whatever
time
you wanted to
passed.
do. But as a slave, you had no chance to move up into society or upper classes of society at all.
And it looks like these. I know we talked about the planter class. It looks like this picture with the slaves is showing.
Exactly.
Those guys are
Mhm.
the planter class
Yeah.
with those slaves,
So
right?
if you can look, you can compare the people on the horses, the two men on the horses, to the upper class or the planter
Right,
class
it's
that we
almost
were
like the
talking
same
about,
guys,
and they're the
right.
same guys.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm.
All right.
So I guess we're off to
Looks like mind and spirit, which is education and religion.
right.
Okay.
And for education, most people were taught at home and not in school, so there was really not a formal education.
So who would that be? Like my mom or dad, or even like an older sister that would be
An
doing
older
the teaching?
sister,
Okay.
an older brother, yeah, and it wouldn't be any formal education. Like you would basically learn through doing chores at home. Okay. So if your parents didn't know how to read, your chances are that you weren't going to know
so a
how
lot
to
of
read.
it depends
But
on
a lot
that.
of people who came to the colonies were educated people. So as they had children, they educated their children.
Okay.
Okay. So
All right.
a lot of them could read and write when they came. The planter class, so we're talking Southern again,
Right.
they actually were wealthy enough to hire teachers to come into their homes and had their
Wow, which
children
we're so used to
educated. So
teachers being
that
so
would be
easy to
more
come
like
across.
being homeschooled, where
Okay.
there was more of a structure.
And it was a definite teacher who knew their
Exactly.
stuff. Okay.
Yeah. So public schools actually started, believe it or not, the Puritans, because they wanted their children to learn from the Bible. So they had one like textbook.
And they use that as like...
They used that as their textbook. So they learned to read and write verses from the Bible.
Okay.
So because there was one source or one resource,
Right.
that you could send your kid to a public school where they knew that they could learn about the Bible.
Okay.
But
So
in
that
the
was
other
like the
case-
curriculum.
right?
Or like
so
what
that's
they
actually
were...
when public school started.
Okay,
Their curriculum
interesting.
was their
Wow.
Bible.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I noticed this: boys receive more education than girls. That seems
Exactly.
unfair, right?
Well, yeah, but if you think about it, who is more than at this time? Girls were in the background.
Right.
You know, they did a lot of housekeeping and sewing.
Not necessarily
and
like
that type
creating
of
the
thing.
businesses
No,
and things like that,
so
going off to work.
So it was advantageous or more likely that the boys would be the breadwinner.
Okay.
Or make the money, and then the girls would be supported by the men. So took a long time, but this way of life, boys receiving more education than girls, hasn't been that long that we value girls in education now today.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So let's go to the spirit part, which
The religion,
is
right?
Religion. Okay. Let's see. What do we have? Religion. Go ahead.
Okay. So
It was very important to all 13 colonies, but to varying degrees.
And they all practiced some kind of little bit of different types of...
it all
like,
depends
it was all
on-
like the Christianity, but a little bit different, like the Puritans, the Quakers.
Yeah,
and-
but you have to remember, and you're going to be learning this later on in another learning target, but why did they come to the colonies?
Oh, I remember
know,
this.
so-
It was because in Europe, when they were coming from England, a lot of times they weren't able to freely practice whatever religion they
Exactly.
wanted to. Like they would be like get thrown in jail, or like they
Right.
didn't have freedom to practice their religion.
Exactly. So, because they were able to practice their own religion, and that's why they came to this new world or to the colonies, religion was it was very important.
Okay.
So one of the ones that we've mentioned already were the Puritans.
Right.
And believe it or not, on Sundays, you could be in church for 5 hours a day.
Well,
That's
a
how
long
important
time.
it was.
Usually
Yes.
it's like an hour or two nowadays.
Exactly, but
wow.
you didn't necessarily pray for 5 hours. It was like a meeting house as well. So they would solve a lot of problems.
because it's not like they had like TV back
Right,
then, or
and,
radios or anything.
and the Puritans, and we're talking in the New England area, their government was based upon the Bible. So it would make sense that when you go to church, you would be talking about how to govern your colony.
Got it. Okay.
Okay. The Great Awakening. What do you remember with that?
Wasn't it like I remember there was a guy that kind of led it, where it was this getting back to the importance of religion. Yeah, right.
Right. Because when the colonies first were established, it was a very hard way of life. And so a lot of people lost their faith.
Right.
Because it was so hard, and there was a lot of people dying because of the weather.
Okay.
The climate was different, diseases,
Right.
and all those type of things. So there came a time in the colonists where they had a renewal of their faith.
Okay.
And getting back to what the Bible had, what the Bible said, and just regaining their faith.
I'd imagine
again.
like building more churches, things like that would be a part of it. Okay.
Okay, now this is probably the fun part.
So these two are gonna have a little conversation about...
Right, because we're going to talk about colonial families.
Right.
So
with
this
their
is
lifestyle.
talking about lifestyle.
Okay.
So go ahead and touch it again.
One of the...
So the leisure. Okay, so not always were they working.
Okay.
Even we work really hard today, but we have our downtime, and that's what leisure time is.
Okay.
It's downtime. It's the time that you have that you're not working.
Right.
Well, things still needed to get done.
Right.
So we had things called bees and frolics. And so bees were like when women would get together and they would have a sewing bee. They would make quilts. And
kind of like a geography bee, but like who can sew.
Who can sew the best,
okay.
or just actually sit around and socialize, maybe gossip a little bit,
Right.
you know. And so they would be doing the work, which would be making the quilts, but then socializing. So that was the
Okay.
leisure time. Frolics, those were more like little dances that they would have, and
Okay.
house barn raising. So if you see,
Oh, yeah, there's that
they're
picture right there
raising a
showing
barn. So they would make this a
So this would be
all-day
like all the guys
activity.
would be like kind of
All
hanging
the
out,
guys
talking.
would be talking and doing their work, but the
Okay.
women would be on the other side preparing all the food for the guys who were working.
So it's kind of like having fun while you're working.
Right.
Right. Because there was so much to do.
There was so much work.
Okay.
Yeah. So children, you know, they were working really hard at their homes and doing all their chores, but they had simple toys and games like what we know today, like Ring Around the Rosie. That's where some of
Right,
those,
okay.
what do we call it? Red Rover.
Oh,
Some of
right,
those
yeah.
games came from there. So if you click, you'll see one of the toys that you'll probably recognize.
Yeah,
Did you
those
ever
are
play
jacks, right? Yeah.
Uh-huh. And adults, they played too. In their really leisure time. So if you click, you're going to see lawn bowling.
So that's kind of like
So-
bowling, but not a bowling alley, just
Yeah,
on here,
and,
like on the fields that they're
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you've ever played bocce ball,
Oh, yeah,
okay,
yeah.
it's kind of like that.
Okay.
They had billiards, and they also played backgammon, and I know you know what backgammon
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
Okay,
So
that's
they had some kind of fun stuff that they
exactly.
did.
Uh-huh.
Maybe not like PlayStation 3, but
No, definitely
something.
not. But to them,
To them that was
to
like
taking
it.
time to play lawn bowling would be like you sitting down and relaxing with
Right.
your PS2 or whatever it's called. Okay, now
Okay.
particularly in the southern colonies, because it was a more rural area, they did fox hunting.
Okay.
You know, as a sport. They played cards because they're with the planter class. They
Right.
had a lot of time on their hands, so they played a lot of cards. And so we're talking maybe poker started. back
Okay.
then,
Oh,
or
right,
hearts, or-
right. Like
yeah,
gin, some of those.
exactly.
Okay.
Horse racing. So if you click, you know what horse racing
Right,
is.
right.
Cockfighting. Do you know what cockfighting
Isn't that
is?
like with, I know it's illegal, like you're not allowed to do it, but it's like with roosters where you like train
Exactly.
your rooster to...
Yeah, you put your rooster in a pen.
It's almost like a
with
little
another
boxing
rooster,
match with like little roosters,
Yeah, it gets
right,
kind of
okay.
bloody and gross, but
Okay.
yeah. And bull baiting. You know what bull baiting
I do
is?
not know what bull baiting is.
Okay, that's another lesson.
Okay,
Okay, so
all
bull
right.
baiting. Colonial fairs focused on competitions of skill.
Okay.
So that would be like if the whole colony or the people in the city got together and had a fair. Now, have you seen where who could saw down the trunk of the tree?
Oh yeah, yeah,
The
or like climbing a
fastest,
tree
climbing
the
a tree the fastest.
Okay,
But
yeah.
it was built. It was based the skill competitions of skill were based upon what work that they did.
Okay.
So who could blow the best glass?
Okay.
You know,
So all
or,
kinds of different like little mini
yeah,
competitions.
yeah,
So
exactly.
they still had
They
still had
had
fun
fun,
back then. It was
right.
a little different than what we're
Exactly.
used to, but
Yeah.
still like getting together and
Exactly.
doing different things.
Uh-huh.
Ooh, I see lots of stuff
Ooh,
here.
Food.
This looks like the food. So
Food.
I know we talked about they didn't have a supermarket, so you couldn't, or a McDonald's.
No,
you
so
definitely had
when
to
I
make your own
said that in the
stuff,
rural
right?
areas they planted crops that they were going to use.
Mm-hmm.
And the longer the colony existed, the more they took those goods to market.
Ah, okay.
So they ate a lot of corn.
Okay.
Now they would either eat the corn off the cob,
Right.
or they would turn it into a flour
Okay.
and make bread
Oh,
and
wow.
that type of thing.
Okay.
Of course, they had chickens where they would lay
Right,
eggs, and then
right.
you could make bread.
Right.
They did have meat. So
Okay.
if that meant that the guy went out and shot a deer,
Right.
you'd bring the meat back. Or perhaps they had a cow,
Right.
and they would butcher it.
So they still had meat, probably not as much as we have today.
No,
but
and it
still had
wasn't
some.
fresh. They would put a lot of salt in it to preserve it, and so a lot of the meat
Because
doesn't
it's not
look
like they had
it is
refrigerators
today.
back
No,
then, so
they
the meat would
didn't.
go bad,
Mhm.
so they needed
Yeah,
to
so they
preserve
needed to
it.
store it. So they would actually have houses specifically built to dry their meat.
Wow,
Mhm.
cool.
And then in the southern area, they grew peaches. the fruit, grapes,
Okay.
all kinds of berries,
Okay.
apples. They had a lot of carrots, root crops probably, squash, beans.
And I noticed the big pot
the
with
pot.
everything.
What do you think that's for?
I would have guessed like throwing a lot of these ingredients together and making
Exactly,
some kind
make
of
it
stew
a
or
stew or
yeah.
a soup. Yeah,
Yum,
and
this is
so
making me hungry.
so actually they would always have the pot of stew. So we saw in those earlier slides
Uh-huh.
where you had the woman tending the fire, and I said that that was her job, probably all day to tend that fire.
Right.
Well, her job probably was to make sure that the stew was stirred and that there was enough of it in case the guys came in from working,
right.
that they would have something
needed
to
something to
eat.
eat.
So there was constantly stew on the stove.
Cool.
Yeah.
Wow, well, I feel like I know way more about all this stuff, and I think hopefully our students will be able
Yeah,
to learn about
yeah.
this too with some
I
of the
think
stuff
it's
that
really
we did.
interesting.
Yeah, cool stuff.
Yeah.
Well,
great.
thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
We're going to kind of exit out, I think, if it works. We want to keep that yes, and we want to stop our recording.